A group of Russian motorcyclists speeds across open ground, hoping that sheer velocity will carry them through the danger zone before Ukraine can react. From that moment, the assault is no longer controlled by the riders on the ground. The motorcycle groups begin to be tracked from above. Engineering vehicles clearing the path are no longer safe. Artillery and logistics units behind them are also drawn into the same zone of danger. What emerges is no longer just a single interception. It shows that Ukraine is using layered UAV systems to detect, transmit data, and strike fast enough to disrupt the entire rhythm of Russian movement. So what kind of surveillance network has Ukraine built that can turn a high-speed assault into a hunted movement so quickly? And why are more and more Russian targets, from the front line to the rear, appearing to fall into the same pattern of pressure at the same time? Stay with Military Force as we break it down. Ukraine is no longer relying on drones as occasional tools that appear for a single strike and then disappear from the fight. It is building a layered aerial presence that keeps parts of the battlefield under watch for extended periods and turns brief moments of exposure into immediate risk. Reconnaissance, UAVs search for movement, identify routes, and help reveal patterns in how Russian forces travel, regroup, and approach contested ground. FPV drones then provide the fast attack option once a target is confirmed, while bomber drones can strike slower or more exposed positions that remain visible long enough to be hit. What makes this important is not simply the number of drones in the air. It is the way different drones are linked into one sequence. One platform finds, another follows, another attacks. That sequence allows Ukraine to apply pressure without waiting for one perfect system to do every task at once. It also means that a target may be in danger long before soldiers on the ground fully realize they have been seen. This is already changing the meaning of tactical control. Control no longer depends only on holding a trench, a road, or a firing line. It increasingly depends on who can observe movement first and act on that information before the other side adjusts. That shift helps explain why so many different Russian targets can now fall under the same kind of pressure in a short period of time. A battlefield shaped by layered UAV coverage does not only threaten one category of force. It places engineering assets, transport movement, light vehicles, and dismounted troops inside the reach of the same surveillance and strike network. Once movement begins, the danger begins with it. The larger effect is psychological as well as tactical. Russian units are no longer operating in an environment where risk starts only near the point of contact. Risk now follows movement itself. A route that looks passable on the ground may already be compromised from above. A pause that seems brief may be long enough for target confirmation. A small exposure may be enough to trigger a strike. This does not mean Ukraine sees everything at all times. It means Ukraine is seeing enough, often enough, to compress the time available for Russian forces to move, organize, and react. That alone can reshape the front. When aerial observation becomes this persistent, exposed ground grows more dangerous, safe routes become harder to trust, and every attempt to advance begins under the shadow of possible detection. Once that kind of drone web is in place, the next issue is no longer whether Russian forces will keep trying to push forward. The real issue is how long those attacks can survive after they leave cover. Russian motorcycle assaults are meant to solve a practical battlefield problem. Heavy armor is easier to detect, easier to target, and harder to move across broken ground under constant drone pressure. Small motorcycle groups offer a different promise. They can move faster, spread out more easily, and cross open stretches before traditional fire systems complete the full cycle of detection, adjustment, and strike. That logic still makes sense on paper. It offers speed, lower cost, and a smaller visual signature than a large armored column. It also gives commanders a way to keep offensive pressure alive when larger vehicles face rising danger near the front and cannot move without drawing immediate attention from above. That is why these assaults should not be dismissed as reckless improvisation alone. They reflect a real attempt to adapt to a battlefield where older methods have become more dangerous and more predictable. The problem is that this adaptation now faces a battlefield that has changed even faster. Once Russian motorcycle groups leave trees, ruined houses, or narrow covered routes, they enter a space where movement itself becomes the signal that gives them away. Ukraine does not need to wait for a large formation to appear. A few fast-moving riders are often enough to trigger observation from above. In sectors already watched by drones, the real contest begins before the attackers reach the objective, because exposure starts during the approach and not only at the point of contact. In that environment, speed stops functioning as protection and starts functioning as exposure. The faster the riders commit to open ground, the faster they reveal direction, spacing, and intent. Instead of confusing the defender, rapid movement can help confirm that an attack is underway. It also reduces the time available for the attackers to change route, slow down, dismount, or disappear back into cover once they realize they have been detected. The reported assault near Sloviansk, where around 16 motorcycles operated in several small groups, captures this problem clearly. The size of the effort suggests that Russian forces were trying to create a real breakthrough effect through tempo, fragmentation, and momentum. Yet the result showed that movement across exposed terrain now carries a penalty that arrives much earlier than many assault plans were originally designed to handle. The assault groups did not simply face random danger. They moved into a combat space where observation was waiting for movement to begin. A motorcycle can shorten the time needed to cross a dangerous strip of terrain. It cannot remove the fact that the strip is being watched. And once a rider is identified and tracked, the original advantage begins to collapse. A small vehicle offers little protection, while a rider has only seconds to react under pressure. A scattered formation may reduce losses from one strike, but it can also create multiple isolated targets instead of one concentrated force. What once looked like a clever answer to drone warfare now risks becoming another pattern that drones can exploit. The more often these assaults rely on the same logic of speed and exposed movement, the easier it becomes for Ukrainian crews to anticipate likely routes, watch likely gaps, and prepare a response before the riders even enter the most dangerous stretch of ground. That is why the tactic now reveals its weakness, almost as clearly as it reveals its intent to observers. This suggests that Russian ground assaults are losing one of their remaining survival logics in sectors where Ukrainian UAV coverage is dense enough to watch, follow, and respond before momentum turns into contact. And once even fast attack groups begin to fail in this way, attention naturally shifts to the vehicles behind them, including those meant not to assault directly, but to open the path for the assault itself. The loss of an IMR-3M means more than the destruction of one armored vehicle near the line. It shows that Ukraine is trying to break a Russian assault before the main force can even form its movement properly. The IMR-3M is a heavy engineering vehicle built on a T-90 chassis, and its task is highly specific. It clears mines, pushes aside obstacles, and opens narrow passages through damaged or defended ground. That role may look secondary beside tanks, infantry, or fast attack groups, but in practice it is one of the first conditions that makes an assault possible. If the path stays blocked, the force behind it cannot keep its intended speed, spacing, or order for very long under pressure. That is why the strike on such a vehicle carries meaning beyond the target itself. Ukraine is not only trying to punish what is already moving at the front, it is also trying to damage the tools that allow movement to happen in the first place. An assault can survive losses and still continue if the route ahead remains open. It becomes far more fragile when the route is still mined, obstructed, or too narrow for safe passage. In that situation, delay becomes the first weapon used against the attack. Units behind the breaching vehicle begin to slow, crowd, or hesitate. Commanders then face a bad choice between waiting and losing momentum, or pushing forward into uncleared ground. This also affects the psychology of the units waiting behind the breach vehicle. When troops know the route ahead has not been cleared, confidence falls before the main clash even begins. Drivers hesitate. Infantry spreads out too early. Commanders are forced to make decisions with less time and less certainty. That loss of confidence matters because assaults depend on rhythm as much as raw force. A formation that doubts the route in front of it will slow down, break spacing, and expose itself in uneven ways across the approach. This is what makes the destruction of an engineering vehicle so important. A minefield does not need to destroy every attacker to stop a push. An obstacle belt does not need to be perfect to break timing. It only needs to remain active long enough to interrupt the sequence of movement that the assault depends on. Once that sequence is broken, the pressure begins to move backward through the whole attacking force. Vehicles behind the blocked point cannot flow through in order. Troops may bunch up, search for another route, or stop in less favorable terrain. Each of those reactions creates new problems for coordination and control. In practical terms, the destruction of one breaching vehicle can create confusion that reaches farther than the blast itself. It turns a technical problem into a tactical one. The blocked path is only the first issue. The second issue is that every unit behind it must now recalculate movement under pressure, while knowing that delay gives the defender more time to observe, prepare, and strike before the assault can fully recover. There is also a broader message in this strike. Support assets behind the leading wave no longer enjoy the level of safety they once expected. A vehicle meant to prepare the route is now exposed to the same danger that threatens the assault element itself. That matters because it compresses the distance between preparation and destruction. A Russian offensive effort can begin losing coherence before its main force fully tests the defense. The road may still be blocked, the mines may still be active, and the choke point may still be sealed. In that situation, the assault loses structure, timing, and the ability to move forward on its own terms. Once both the assault units and the vehicles that open the path are drawn into the same danger zone, the focus shifts to how quickly Ukraine can turn detection into destruction. Ukraine's advantage in this phase of the war comes from speed of connection, not only speed of flight. The major change is that drones are no longer appearing as isolated tools over the battlefield. They are being linked into a short combat loop in which detection, confirmation, and attack happen so quickly that a target may still be under observation when the strike is already moving toward it. That is what makes this system so dangerous. A reconnaissance. UAV locates movement, identifies a likely target, and passes that information almost at once. An FPV drone, or a bomber drone, then enters the same space before the target can leave the watched area, regroup, or hide again. The structure is simple, but the effect is severe because it cuts away the time that once gave units a chance to recover after being seen. This is why the pressure created by Ukrainian drones feels continuous, even when different platforms carry out different strikes. The real strength does not come from one aircraft doing everything. It comes from several tasks being linked together in the right order and at the right speed. One drone searches, another keeps contact, another delivers the strike. That sequence matters more than simple numbers. A force with many drones but a slow response cycle will still waste chances. A force with a shorter loop can create repeated danger from even brief exposure. This logic helps explain why very different Russian targets have been hit in ways that look increasingly connected. Motorcycle groups moving through open stretches, engineering vehicles working near blocked routes, and other exposed assets are not falling victim to unrelated accidents. They are entering the same pattern of rapid observation followed by fast engagement. The battlefield is therefore being shaped by time as much as by firepower. Minutes now carry a weight that once belonged more to distance or armor. A short delay in reporting, launch, or strike can allow survival. A short delay in movement, concealment, or reaction can bring destruction. That balance favors the side that can shrink the interval between noticing a target and attacking it. Ukraine appears to be doing exactly that. It is turning battlefield information into actionable firepower before Russian units can fully adapt to being seen. This does not mean every sighting ends in a successful strike. War remains uneven, and many targets will still escape, survive, or avoid contact. But the larger pattern matters more than any single clip. When the cycle works often enough, it begins to change behavior across the front. Movement becomes more cautious. Routes become less predictable. Time spent in the open becomes harder to justify. And once a combat system can punish exposure this quickly, its effect no longer stops with the destruction of individual targets. It begins to spread pressure onto the supporting parts that keep offensive operations alive. That is when tactical pressure begins to turn into operational strain, with consequences that extend beyond the first strike zone. That is why the next stage of the story is no longer only about who gets hit on the move. It is about what happens when this same speed starts reaching the artillery positions and the logistical flow that keep Russian forces fighting near the front. Russia is facing pressure not only at the point of attack, but also in the systems that keep attacks alive once they begin. That pressure is now falling on two critical supports at the same time: artillery and logistics. When both weaken together, the result is larger than the loss of a few guns, trucks, or fuel points. It means the force at the front begins to lose both the fire support that protects movement and the supplies that allow movement to continue. Russian artillery remains dangerous, but it depends on time, position, and continuity. A gun crew must deploy, prepare the weapon, receive data, fire, adjust, and often remain in place long enough to repeat the cycle. That process creates a window of vulnerability. Even when guns are camouflaged or placed near cover, they still need enough stability to do their job. Once an artillery position is found, the issue is not only whether the gun is destroyed, but whether it can still support troops under threat from above. That helps explain why this pressure can reduce the weight of Russian fire even without dramatic losses in a single strike. The effect is often quieter, but still serious. Artillery becomes less stable and less able to support an assault with the same rhythm as before. At the same time, Ukraine is applying pressure to the flow of fuel, ammunition, and transport that keeps frontline units functioning. Fuel tanks, supply vehicles, and storage points matter because they sustain combat after the first assault wave moves forward. A unit at the front can endure stress for a short period, but it cannot preserve combat effectiveness for long if fuel arrives late, ammunition runs short, or transport is disrupted on the way to the line. Repeated disruption changes the pace of combat and forces commanders to manage shortage instead of shaping the fight. The frontline force then begins to feel stress from both directions at once. It receives less support from behind and fewer resources from the rear. That combination can weaken offensive pressure even before the attacking force suffers a major collapse in manpower. Russia does not need to lose an entire formation in one moment to feel the battlefield shift against it. It can lose fighting power gradually as guns become harder to use and supplies become harder to move. This kind of decline is often harder to measure in one dramatic moment, but its battlefield effect can be deeper over time. A force under this pressure may still fight, yet it fights with less freedom, less consistency, and less momentum. That kind of erosion is dangerous because it is steady, practical, and difficult to reverse quickly once it spreads across multiple sectors. And when fire support and supply flow both begin to fail in this way, the next stage of pressure will not remain limited to the nearest line of contact. It will naturally expand toward the wider network behind the front, including air defense, rear bases, and the larger operational structure that keeps the war machine running. Ukraine is no longer limiting its strikes to the targets that appear at the immediate point of contact. It is widening the battlefield by attacking the systems behind the front that protect, supply, and organize Russian combat activity. That is why pressure on air defense units such as Tor and Pantsir matters beyond the loss of equipment itself. Each system removed from action weakens one layer of protection that helps shield positions, transport routes, and support zones from further drone activity. The result is not simply a gap in hardware. It is a wider sense of exposure across the rear. Russian units must then operate with more caution in areas that once offered more security than the front line itself. Rear zones are where ammunition is stored, repairs are handled, fuel is distributed, and decisions are turned into action. When these areas become less protected, the burden falls on the whole structure behind the fighting. A drone strike in the rear can therefore carry more weight than its immediate physical damage suggests. It can force dispersal, delay movement, and make commanders spend more time protecting support functions that are supposed to work without interruption. The same logic applies to rear bases, ammunition depots, and logistics centers. When one of these sites is hit, the effect does not stop at the blast. A damaged storage point can slow delivery schedules. A disrupted logistics hub can interfere with transport plans, repair cycles, and local coordination. A strike near command-related facilities can produce confusion that takes time to correct under pressure. This is why the effect becomes larger than one destroyed target. Ukraine is not only removing material, it is interfering with the system that allows Russian forces to stay organized and supplied over time. That gives these drone attacks an importance beyond the tactical level. As air defense weakens, rear activity becomes easier to threaten. As rear activity is disrupted, frontline units become harder to sustain. Pressure then begins to move through the structure of the war itself, instead of remaining tied to one local incident. Ukraine appears to be moving from destroying individual targets to stressing the wider machinery that keeps Russian operations running. And once that pressure reaches from the front line to the rear, the question is no longer only how many targets have been lost. The real question is, which side is shaping the pace and conditions of the war? What this battlefield now reveals is a shift in the logic of survival. Speed still matters. Armor still matters. Firepower still matters. But none of them can guarantee protection when movement is watched from above and response follows within moments. Ukraine's growing strength lies not only in the number of drones it can launch, but in the way aerial surveillance, target tracking, and strike timing are being fused into one fast combat process. That is why these events point to more than a series of successful attacks. They point to a battlefield where exposure itself is becoming the first defeat. Russia is being pushed to adapt not just to a new weapon, but to a new combat environment in which delay, visibility, and timing may decide outcomes before the main clash even begins. If that pattern continues, control of information may become the clearest measure of control on the ground. If you value clear, fact-based analysis of how modern warfare is evolving, subscribe to Military Force for regular updates. These reports are not just about weapons and tactics, but about understanding the human and strategic cost behind every conflict. Stay informed, because learning how war works is one step toward understanding why peace matters.